Festival of Birds. Waking to the dice, Matt considered going back to sleep until they went away. But at last he got up feeling grumpy, as if he did not have more than enough on his plate already. He chased Narum away and dressed himself, eating the last of the bread and cheese from the night before while he did, then went to check on Oliver. The boy flashed between bursts of yanking on his clothes in a hurry to be out and stopping entirely with boot or shirt in hand to spout dozens of questions that Matt answered with half a mind. No, they would not go racing today, and never mind the rich races at the Circuit of Heaven north of the city. Maybe they could go see the menagerie. Yes, Matt would buy him a feathered mask for the festival, if he ever got dressed. That sent him into a flurry. What really occupied Matt's thoughts were those bloody dice. Why had they started up again? He still did not know why they had before. When Oliver was finally clothed, he followed Matt into the sitting room, bubbling with half-heard questions, and bumped him from behind when he stopped dead. Tylen replaced the book Oliver had been reading the night before on the table. Majesty! Matt's eyes darted to the door he had locked last night, now standing wide open. What a surprise! He pulled Oliver around in front of him, between him and the woman's mocking smile. Well, maybe it was not really mocking, but it surely seemed so right then. She was certainly pleased with herself. I was about to take Oliver out to see the festival and some traveling menagerie. He wants a feathered mask. He snapped his mouth shut to stop babbling and started edging toward the door, using the boy as a shield. Yes, Tylen murmured, watching through her eyelashes. She made no move to intervene, but her smile deepened, as if she was just waiting for his foot to land in the snare. Much better if he has a companion instead of running with the urchins, as I hear he does. One hears a good deal about your lad. Rosella? A woman appeared in the doorway, and Matt gave a start. A fanciful mask of swirling blue and golden feathers hid most of Rosella's face, but the feathers on the rest of her costume did not hide very much else. She possessed the most spectacular bosom he had ever seen. Oliver, she said, sinking to her knees, would you like to walk out with me at festival? She held up a mask like a red and green hawk, just the right size for a boy. Before Matt could open his mouth, Oliver broke free and rushed to her. Oh, yes, please. Thank you. The ungrateful little lout laughed as she tied the hawk mask on his face and hugged him to her bosom. Hand in hand, they ran out, leaving Matt gaping. He recovered himself quickly enough when Tylen said, Well, for you, I am not a jealous woman, my sweet. She produced the long iron key to his door from behind her gold and silver belt, and then another just like it, waggling the pair at him. People always keep keys in a box near the door. That was where he had left his. And no one ever thinks there might be a second key. One key went back behind her belt. The other was turned in the lock with a loud click before joining its fellow. Now then, she smiled. It was too much. The woman hounded him, tried to starve him. Now she locked them in together like he did not know what. Lambkin? Those bloody dice were bouncing around in his skull. Besides, he had important business to see to. The dice had never had anything to do with finding something, but... He reached her in 2 long strides, seized her arm, and began fumbling in her belt for the keys. I don't have bloody time for... His breath froze as the sharp point of her dagger beneath his chin shut his mouth and drove him right up onto his toes. Remove your hand, she said coldly. He managed to look down his nose at her face. She was not smiling now. He let go of her arm carefully. She did not lessen the pressure of her blade, though. She shook her head.
Hey, Charles, how you doing?
For you being
Good to see you.
costly. But Since you wish to play roughly, hands
Hope
at
you're
your
doing well.
sides. Move.
Not too bad. Can't
The knife
complain.
point gave a direction. He shuffled backward on tiptoe rather than have his neck sliced. What are you going to do? He mumbled through his teeth. A stretched neck put a strain in his voice. A stretched neck, among other things. Well, he could try grabbing her wrist. He was quick with his hands. What are you going to do? Quick enough with the knife already at his throat.
Let's do
That
a
was the
jab.
question. That and the one he asked her. If she intended to kill him, a shove of her wrist right there would drive the dagger straight up into his brain. Will you answer me? That was not panic in his voice. He was not in panic. Majesty? Tylen? Well, maybe he was in a bit of a panic, to use her name. You could call any woman in Abu Dar duckling or pudding all day, and she would smile. But use her name before she said you could, and you found a hotter reception than you would for goosing a strange woman on the street anywhere else. A few kisses exchanged were never enough for permission either. Tylen did not answer, only kept him tiptoeing backward until suddenly his shoulders bumped against something that stopped him. With that flaming dagger never easing a hair, he could not move his head. But his eyes, that had been focused on her face, darted. They were in the bedchamber, a flower-carved red bedpost hard between his shoulder blades. Why would she bring him? His face was suddenly as crimson as the bedpost. No, she could
Since I
not
got it
mention.
loaded, let's put
It was
this
not
on.
decent. It was not possible. You can't do this to me, he mumbled at her. And if his voice was a touch brassy
Before I
and
hit
shrill,
this,
he
let's load
surely
the other
had
one
cause.
up too.
Watch and
Let's
learn,
load this one up.
my kitten, Tylen said, and drew her marriage knife. Afterward, a considerable time later, he irritably pulled the sheet up to his chest. A silk sheet. Nalisian had been right. The Queen of Altara hummed happily beside the bed, arms twisted behind her to do up the buttons of her dress. All he had on was the fox-head medallion on its cord, much good that had done, and the black scarf tied around his neck. A ribbon on her present, the bloody woman called it. He rolled over and snatched his silver-mounted pipe and tobacco pouch from the small table on the other side from her. Golden tongs and a hot coal in a golden bowl of sand provided the means for lighting. Folding his arms, he puffed away as fiercely as he frowned. You should not plow, Stephen, and you shouldn't hunt. She yanked her dagger from where it was driven into a bedpost beside her marriage knife, examining the point before sheathing it. What is the matter? You know you enjoyed yourself as much as I did. And I... She laughed suddenly and oh so richly, resheathing the marriage knife as well. If that is part of what being Targaryens, you must be very popular. Nat flushed like fire. It isn't natural, he burst out, yanking the pipe stem from between his teeth. I'm the one who's supposed to do the chasing. Her astonished eyes surely mirrored his own. Had Tylen been a tavern maid who smiled the right way, he might have tried his luck. Well, if the tavern maid lacked a son who liked poking holes in people. But he was the one who chased. He had just never thought of it that way before. He had never had the need to before. Tylen began laughing, shaking her head and wiping at her eyes with her fingers. Oh, Pigeon, I do keep forgetting. You are in Abu Dar now. I left a little present for you in the sitting room. She patted his foot through the sheet. Eat well today. You are going to need your strength. Over his eyes and tried very hard. When he uncovered them, he tucked the sheet around him. For some reason, the notion of walking around bare felt uncomfortable. The bloody woman might leap out of the wood. The garments he had been wearing lay on the floor. You can just cut these clothes off. She had no dislike of the red coat that way, though. She had just enjoyed feeling him with her knife. Not quite holding his breath, he pulled open the tall red and yellow
Nice.
wardrobe. She was not hiding inside.
Finally got that
His
dialed
choices
in
were
on this
limited.
one.
Naram had most of his coats for cleaning or mending. Dressing quickly, he chose a plain coat of dark bronze silk, then stuffed the sliced rags as far under the bed as he could reach until he could dispose of them without Naram seeing. Or anyone else, for that matter. Too many people already knew entirely too much of what was going on between him and Thailand. There was no way he could face anybody knowing this. In the sitting room, he lifted the lid of the lacquerware box by the door, then let it fall with a sigh. He had not waited for Thailand to replace the key. He leaned against the door.
Hell yeah, Charles.
He
Definitely
unlocked the
appreciate it.
door. Light, what was he going to do? Move back to the inn?
Okay, now time for
Burn
the
out
other one.
guys had stopped before. Only he would
Here
not
in a
put it
sec,
past Thailand to
anyways.
bribe Mistress Annan and Enid, or the innkeeper wherever he went. He would not put it past Nynaeve and Elaine to claim he had broken some agreement and put an end to their promises. Burn all women. A large parcel, elaborately wrapped in green paper, sat on one of the tables. It contained an eagle mask in black and gold, and a coat covered with feathers to match. There was also a red silk purse holding 20 gold crowns, and a note that smelled of flowers. I would have bought you an earring, Piglet, but I noticed your ear is not pierced. Have it done, and buy yourself something nice. He nearly wept again. He gave women presents. The world was standing on its head. Piglet? Oh, light. After a minute, he did take the mask. She owed him that much, for his coat alone. When he finally reached the small, shaded courtyard, where they had been meeting each morning beside a tiny round pool of lily pads and brightly spotted white fish, he found Elysian and Brigitte ready for the Festival of Birds, too. The Tyrian had contented himself with a plain green mask, but Brigitte's was a spray of yellow and red with a crest of plumes. Her golden hair hung loose, with feathers tied all down its length, and she wore a dress with a wide yellow belt, diaphanous beneath more red and yellow feathers. It did not reveal nearly as much as Rosella's, yet it seemed about to every time she moved. He had never thought of her wearing a dress like other women. Sometimes it's fun to be looked at, she said, poking him in the ribs when he commented. Her grin would have done for an Elysian, saying how much fun it was to pinch serving girls. There's a lot more to it than feather dancers wore, but not enough to slow me down. And anyway, I cannot see you'll have to move quickly on this side of the river. The dice rattled in his head. What kept you? She went on. You didn't make us wait so you could tickle a pretty girl, I hope. He hoped he was not blushing. He was not certain what excuse he would have made, but just then half a dozen men wearing feathered coats strolled into the courtyard, all with those narrow swords on their hips, all but one wearing an elaborate mask with colorful crest and beak that represented no bird ever seen by human eyes. The exception was Beslin, twirling his mask by its ribbon. Oh, blood and bloody ashes, what's he doing here? Beslin? Elysian folded his hands in the pommel of his sword and shook his head in disbelief. Why, burn my soul, he says he intends to spend the festival in your company. Some promise you two made, he says. I told him it would be deadly boring, but he wouldn't believe me. I cannot think it is ever boring around Matt, Tyland's son said. His bow took them all in, but his dark eyes especially lingered on Brigitte. I've never had so much fun as I did drinking with him in Lady Elaine's water on Swoban night. The truth, I remember little. He did not seem to recognize that water. Strangely, considering the taste she had shown in men, Beslin was fine-looking, maybe a little too fine, not at all her sort. Strangely, she smiled slightly and preened under his scrutiny. Right then, Matt did not care how out of character she behaved. Obviously, Beslin suspected nothing, or that sort of his likely would already be out, but the last thing under the light Matt wanted was a day in company with the man. It would be excruciating. He had some sense of decency, even if Beslin's mother did not. The only problem was Beslin, who took that bloody promise to attend all the festivals and feast days together very seriously. The more Matt agreed with Nelisian that the day they had planned would be dull beyond belief, the more determined Beslin grew. After a bit, his face began to darken, and Matt began to think that sword might be unsheathed yet. Well, a promise was a promise. When he and Nelisian and Brigida left the palace, half a dozen feathered fools strutted along. Matt was sure it would not have happened had Brigida been wearing her proper clothes. The whole lot of them kept eyeing her and smiling. What was all that twisting around while he was spilling his eyes all over you? He muttered as they crossed the Mulhara. He tugged the ribbon holding the eagle mask tighter. I did not twist, I moved. Her primness was so blatantly false, he would have laughed some other time. Slightly. Abruptly, her grin was back, and she lowered her voice for his ear alone. I told you, sometimes it's fun to be looked at. Just because they're all too pretty doesn't mean I cannot enjoy them looking. Oh, you'll want to look at her, she added, pointing to a slender woman who went running by in a blue owl mask and rather fewer feathers than Rosella had worn. That was one of the things about Brigida. She would nudge him in the ribs and point out a pretty girl for his eyes readily as any man he had ever known, and expect him to point out in turn what she liked to see, which was generally the ugliest man in sight. Whether or not she chose to go half naked today, a quarter anyway, she was, well, a friend. A strange world it was turning out to be. One woman he was beginning to think of as a drinking companion, and another after him as intently as he had ever pursued any pretty woman. In those old memories or his own. More intently, he had never chased any woman who let him know she did not want to be chased. A very strange world. The sun stood little more than halfway to its peak, but already celebrants filled the streets and squares and bridges. Tumblers and jugglers and musicians with feathers sewn about their clothes performed at every street corner, the music often drowned in laughter and shouting. For the poorer folk, a few feathers laced into their hair sufficed, pigeon feathers gathered from the pavement for the street children dodging about and the beggars. But masks and costumes grew more elaborate as purses grew heavier. More elaborate and frequently men and women alike were often decked in feathers that revealed more skin than Rosella or that woman back in the Mulhara. No commerce moved in the streets or canals today, though a number of shops seemed to be open, along with every tavern and inn, of course. But here and there a wagon made its way through the throng, or a barge was pulled along supporting a platform where young women and men posed in bright bird masks that covered their entire heads, with spreading crests sometimes rising a full pace, moving long, colorful wings in such a way that the rest of their costumes were exposed only in flashes, which was just as well, considering. According to Beslin, these settings, as they were called, were usually presented in guild halls and private palaces and houses. The entire festival normally took place indoors for the most part. It did not snow properly in Ebudar, even when the weather was as it should be. Beslin said he would like to see this snow one day. But apparently ordinary winter was cold enough to keep people from running around outdoors all but unclothed. With the heat, everything was spilling into the streets. Wait until night fell, Beslin said. Then Matt would really see something. As sunlight faded, so did inhibitions. Staring at a tall, slender woman gliding along through the crowd in mask and feathered cloak, and beyond that, 6 or 7 feathers, Matt wondered what inhibitions some of these folk had left to shed. He almost shouted at her to cover herself with that cloak. She was pretty, but out in the street? Before the light and everybody? Those wagons carrying the settings attracted followers, of course. Thick knots of men and women who shouted and laughed as they tossed coins, and sometimes folded notes onto the wagons and squeezed everyone else in the street aside. He became used to fleeing ahead until they could duck down a crossing street, or waiting until the setting went by to cross an intersection or bridge. While waiting, Brigitte and Elysian tossed coins to filthy urchins and dirtier beggars. Well, Nelisian tossed. Brigida concentrated on the children and pressed each coin into a grubby hand like a gift. In one of those waits, Veslin suddenly put a hand on Nelisian's arm, raising his voice above the crowd and a cacophony of music coming from at least 6 different places. "Forgive me, Tyrin, but not him." The ragged man edged back into the throng, warily. Gaunt-cheeked and bony, he seemed to have lost whatever pitiful feathers he might have found for his hair. "Why not?" Nelisian demanded. "No brass ring on his little finger," Veslin replied. "He's not in the guild." "Light," Matt said. "A man can't even beg in this city without belonging to a guild." Maybe it was his tone. The beggar leaped for his throat, a knife appearing in his grimy fist. Without thinking, Matt grabbed the man's arm and spun, slinging him away into the crowd. Some people cursed at Matt, some at the sprawling beggar. Some tossed the fellow a coin. From the corner of his eye, Matt saw a second skinny man in rags try to push Brigida out of the way to reach him with a long knife. It was a foolish mistake to underestimate the woman because of her costume. From somewhere among those feathers, she produced a knife and stabbed him beneath the arm. "Look out!" Matt shouted at her, but there was no time for warnings. Even as he shouted, he drew from his coat sleeve and threw sidearmed. The blade streaked past her face to sink into the throat of yet another beggar flaunting steel before he could plant it in her ribs. Suddenly, there were beggars everywhere with knives and clubs studded with spikes. Screams and shouts rose as people in masks and costumes scrambled to get out of the way. Nelisian slashed a man in rags across the face, sending him reeling. Veslin ran another through the middle, while his costumed cronies fought still others. Matt had no time to see more. He found himself back to back with Brigida and facing his own adversaries. He could feel her shifting against him, hear her mutter curses, but he was barely conscious of it. Brigida could take care of herself, and watching the 2 men in front of him, he was not sure he could do the same. The hulking fellow with the toothless sneer had only one arm and a puckered socket where his left eye had been, but his fist held a club 2 feet long, encircled by iron bands that sprouted spikes like steel thorns. His rat-faced little companion still had both eyes and several teeth, and despite sunken cheeks and arms that seemed all bone and sinew, he moved like a snake, licking his lips and flicking a rusty dagger from hand to hand. Matt aimed the shorter knife in his own hand, first one, then the other. It was still long enough to reach a man's vitals, and they danced and shuffled, each waiting for the other to leap at him first. "Old Cully won't like this spar," the bigger man growled, and Ratface darted forward, rusty blade flashing from hand to hand. He did not count on the knife that suddenly appeared in Matt's left hand and sliced across his wrist. The dagger clattered to the paving stones, but the fellow flung himself at Matt anyway. As Matt's other blade stabbed into his chest, he squealed, eyes going wide, arms wrapping around Matt convulsively. The bald fellow's sneer widened, his club rising as he stepped in. The grin vanished as 2 beggars swarmed over him, snarling and stabbing. Staring incredulously, Matt shoved Ratface's corpse away. The street was clear for 50 paces except for combatants, and everywhere beggars rolled on the pavement, 2 or 3 or sometimes 4 stabbing at one, beating him with clubs or rocks. Veslin caught Matt's arm. There was blood on his face, but he was grinning. "Let's get out of here and let the Fellowship of Alms finish its business. There's no honor in fighting beggars. Besides, the guild won't leave any of these interlopers alive. Follow me." Nelisian was scowling. Doubtless he saw no honor in fighting beggars either. And Veslin's friends, several with their costumes awry, and one with his mask off so another could dab at a cut across his forehead. The man with the cut was grinning too. Brigida bore not a scratch that Matt could see, and her costume looked as neat as it had back in the palace. She made her knife disappear. There was no way she could hide a blade under those feathers, but she did. Matt made no protest at being drawn away, but he did growl, "Do beggars always go around attacking people in this city?" Veslin might not appreciate hearing it called a bloody city. The man laughed. "You are Taviran, Matt. There's always excitement around Taviran." Matt smiled back with gritted teeth. Bloody fool, bloody city, and bloody Taviran. Well, if a beggar slit his throat, he would not have to go back to the palace and let Thailand peel him like a ripe pear. Come to think of it, she had called him her little pear. Bloody everything! The street between the dyer's shop and the rows of the ale bar had its share of revelers, though not many scantily clad. Apparently you had to have coin to go near naked. Though the acrobats in front of the merchant's house on the corner came close, the men barefoot and bare-chested in tight, brightly colored breeches, the women in even tighter breeches and thin blouses. They all had a few feathers in their hair, as did the capering musicians playing in front of the small palace at the far corner. A woman with a flute, another blowing on a tall, twisted black tube covered with levers, and a fellow beating a timbre for all he was worth. The house they had come to watch looked shut up tight. The tea at the Rose was as bad as ever, which meant it was much better than the wine. Elysian stuck to the sour local ale. Brigitte said thanks without saying for what, and Matt shrugged it off silently. They grinned at each other and tapped cups. The sun rose, and Beslin sat balancing first one boot on the toe of the other, then the other way around. But his companions began growing restive, no matter how often he pointed out that Matt was severe. A scuffle with beggars was hardly proper excitement. The street was too narrow for any settings to pass. The women were not as pretty as elsewhere, and even looking at Brigitte seemed to pall once they realized that she did not intend to kiss even one of them. With protestations of regret that Beslin would not come, they hurried off to find somewhere more exhilarating. Elysian took a stroll down the alley beside the dyers, and Brigitte vanished into the Rose's murky interior to find, she said, whether there was anything at all fit to drink hidden in some forgotten corner. I never expected to see a warder garbed like that, Beslin said, changing his boots around. Matt blinked. The fellow had sharp eyes. She had not removed her mask once. Well, as long as he did not know about it. I think you will be good for my mother, Matt. Choking, Matt sprayed tea into the passers-by. Several glared at him angrily, and one slender woman with a nice little bosom gave him a coy smile from beneath the blue mask he thought was meant to be a wren. She stamped a foot and stalked off when he did not smile back. Luckily, no one was angry enough to take it beyond glares before they too went on their way. Or maybe unluckily. He would not have minded if 6 or 8 piled on him right then. What do you mean? He said hoarsely. Beslin's head whipped around in wide-eyed surprise. Why, her choosing you for her pretty, of course. Why is your face so red? Are you angry? Why? Suddenly he slapped his forehead and laughed. You think I will be angry? Forgive me. I forget you're an outlander. Matt, she's my mother, not my wife. Father died 10 years ago, and she has always claimed to be too busy. I'm just glad she chose someone I like. Where are you going? He did not realize he was on his feet until Beslin spoke. I just need to clear my head. But you're drinking tea, Matt. Dodging around a green sedan chair, he half saw the door of the house open, and a woman with a blue-feathered cloak over her dress slip out. Unthinkingly, his head was spinning too much to think clearly, he fell in behind her. Beslin knew. He approved. His own mother, and he... Matt, Elysian shouted behind him, where are you going? If I'm not back by tomorrow, Matt shouted back absently over his shoulder, tell them they'll have to find it for themselves. He walked on after the woman in a daze, not hearing if Elysian or Beslin shouted again. The man knew. He remembered once thinking that Beslin and his mother were both mad. They were worse. All of Abu Dar was mad. He was hardly aware of the dice still spinning inside his skull.
From a window of the meeting room, Rihanna watched Solane disappear down the street toward the river. Some fellow in a bronze coat followed in her wake, but if he tried to impede her, he would find out soon enough that Solane had no time for men and no patience with them. Rihanna was not sure why the urge had grown so strong today. For days it had come on almost with the morning and faded with the sun, and for days she had fought, By the strict rules they did not quite dare call laws, that order was given at the half moon, still 6 nights off. But today, she had spoken the order before she thought, and been unable to make herself retract until the proper time. It would be well. No one had seen any sign of those 2 young fools calling themselves Elaine and Nynaeve anywhere in the city. Thank the light, there had been no need to take dangerous chances. Sighing, she turned to the others, who waited until she took her chair before seating themselves. It would be well, as it always had been. Secrets would be kept, as they always had been. But still, she had no touch of foretelling or anything of that sort, yet perhaps that overwhelming urge had been telling her something. 12 women watched her expectantly. I think we should consider moving everyone who does not wear the belt to the farm for a little while. There was little discussion. They were the elders, but she was the eldest. In that, at least, there was no harm in behaving as Aes Sedai did. Chapter 30. The First Cup. I do not understand this, Elaine protested. She had not been offered a chair. In fact, when she started to sit, she'd been told curtly to remain standing. 5 sets of eyes were focused on her, 5 women with set, grim faces. You are behaving as if we've done something terrible, when what we have done is find the bowl of the winds. At least they were on the brink of it, she hoped. The message Nalesian had come running back with was none too clear. Matt had gone off shouting that he had found it, or something very like, Nalesian allowed. The longer he talked, the more he bounced between absolute certainty and doubt. Birgitta had remained watching Rihanna's house. She seemed sweaty and bored. In any case, matters were in motion. Elaine wondered how Nynaeve was getting on. Better than herself, she hoped. She had certainly never expected this when she revealed their success. You have endangered a secret kept close by every woman to wear the shawl for over 2,000 years. Marillilla sat stiff-backed, serenity almost abandoned, on the tight-lipped brink of apoplexy. You must have been insane. Only madness could excuse this. What secret? Elaine demanded. Vandine, flanking Marillilla with her sister, adjusted pale green silk skirts irritably and said, Time enough for that when you've been properly raised, child. I thought you had some sense. Adelius, in a dark gray wool with deep brown trim, nodded, mirroring Vandine's disapproval. The child cannot be faulted for revealing a secret she did not know, Cariana Franci said from Elaine's left, shifting her bulk in her green and gilt armchair. She was not stout, but almost, with shoulders as wide and arms as thick as most men. Tower law does not allow for excuses, Saritha put in quickly, in somewhat self-important tones, her normally inquisitive brown eyes stern. Once mere excuses are allowed, inevitably lesser and lesser excuses will become acceptable until law itself is gone. Her high-backed chair stood to the right. Only she wore her shawl, but Marililla's sitting room had been arranged as a court, though no one called it that. So far, no one had. Marillilla, Adelius, and Vandine confronted Elaine like judges. Saritha's chair was placed where the seat of rebuke would be, and Cariana's the seat of pardon. But the Damani Green, who would have been her defender, nodded thoughtfully, as the Tyron Brown, who would have been her prosecutor, continued. She has admitted guilt from her own mouth. I recommend that the child be confined to the palace until we leave, with some good hard work to occupy her mind and her hands. I also recommend a firm dose of the slipper at regular intervals to remind her not to go behind sisters' backs, and the same for Nynaeve, as soon as she can be found. Elaine swallowed. Confined? Perhaps they did not need to name the trial for it to be one. Saritha might not yet have achieved the ageless face. The weight of the other women's years pressed at Elaine. Adelius and Van Deen with their hair nearly all white, even their ageless faces echoing years. Marililla's hair was glossy black, yet Elaine would not have been surprised to learn she had worn the shawl as long or longer than most women not Aes Sedai lived. For that matter, Cariana might have as well. Not one of them approached her own strength and the power, but all that experience as Aes Sedai, all that knowledge, all that authority. A heavy reminder that she was only 18 and had been in Novice White a year ago. Cariana made no move to rebut Saritha's suggestions. Perhaps she best go on defending herself. Plainly, this secret you speak of has something to do with the circle, but the kin are no concern of yours, child. Marililla broke in sharply. Drawing a deep breath, she smoothed gold-slashed skirts of silvery gray. I propose to pass sentence, she said in a cold voice. I concur and defer to your decision, Adelius said. She gave Elaine a disappointed frown and shook her head. Van Deen waved her hand dismissively. I concur and defer, but I agree with the seat of rebuke. Cariana's look might have contained a sliver of sympathy. Maybe a sliver. Marililla opened her mouth. The timid knock at the door sounded quite loud in the momentary thunderous silence. What under the light? Marililla muttered angrily. I told Paul not to let anyone disturb us. Cariana? Not the youngest, but the lowest in strength, Cariana stood and glided to the door. Despite her heft, she always moved like a swan. It was Paul herself, Marililla's maid, who popped in curtsying left and right. A slender, gray-haired woman, usually possessed of a dignity to rival that of her mistress, she wore an anxious frown now, as well she might, barging in after Marililla's instructions. Elaine had not been so glad to see anyone since Matt Cawthon appeared in the Stone of Tyr. A horrendous thought. If Avienda did not say she had met Toh sufficiently soon, she might just see if asking the man to beat her after all could end the agony. The Queen brought this herself, Paul announced breathily, proffering a letter sealed with a large red lump of wax. She said if I didn't give it to Elaine right away, she'd bring it in herself. She said it's about the child's mother. Elaine almost ground her teeth. The sisters' serving women had all picked up their mistress's way of talking about Nynaeve and her, if seldom where they could hear. Furious, she snatched the letter without waiting for Marililla to say she could, if that was what she would have said, and broke the seal with her thumb. My Lady Elaine, I greet the daughter heir of Andor with joyous news. I have but just learned that your mother, Queen Morghese, lives, and is at present the guest of Padron Nile in Amador, and wishes above all to be reunited with you, so that you may return to Andor together in triumph. I offer escort through the bandits now infesting Altara, so that you may reach your mother's side in safety and all speed. Forgive these few poor words, scribbled in haste, but I know you would wish to learn the wondrous news as soon as possible. Until I can leave you at your mother's side. Sealed in the light, Jakim Karadin. The paper crumpled in her fist. How dare he? The pain of her mother's death, without even a body to be buried, was only beginning to fade, and Karadin dared mock her this way? Embracing the true source, she hurled the foul lies away from her and channeled. Fire flared in midair, so hot that only a dust of ash fell to the blue and gold floor tiles. That for Jakim Karadin! And as for these women, the pride of 1,000 years of Andoran queens put steel into her backbone. Marililla surged to her feet. You were not given permission to channel. You will release the... Leave us, Paul, Elaine said. Now. The serving woman stared, but Elaine's mother had taught her well the voice of command, the voice of a queen from her throne. Paul bobbed a curtsy and was moving before she realized. Once underway, She hesitated only an instant before hurrying out and
Hey,
closing the door
Christopher, how
behind
you
her.
doing?
Whatever
Good to
was about
see
to
ya.
happen plainly was for Aes Sedai alone. What has gotten into you, child? Pure fury submerged the remnants of Marililla's regathered calm. Release the source immediately, or I vow I'll fetch a slipper myself this minute. I am Aes Sedai. The words came out like winter.
Salut Chris, j'espère que tu vas bien.
Words came out like winter stone, and Elaine meant them to. Corridon's lies, and these women. Marillilla threatened to slipper her? They would acknowledge her rightful place as a sister. She and Nynaeve had found the bowl, as good as anyway, and the arrangements for its use were underway. You proposed to punish me for endangering a secret apparently known only to sisters, but no one bothered to tell me this secret when I attained the shawl. You suggest punishing me like a novice or accepted, but I am Aes Sedai. I was raised to the shawl by Egwene Alvier, the Amerlin you claim to serve. If you deny that Nynaeve and I are Aes Sedai, then you deny the Amerlin seat who sent me to find the Bowl of the Winds, which we have done. I will not have it. I call you to account, Marillilla Devon. Submit to the will of the Amerlin seat, or I will call judgment on you as a rebellious traitor. Marililla's eyes bulged, and her mouth hung open, but she appeared composed beside Cariana or Saritha, who looked about to choke to death on incredulity. Vandine seemed mildly taken aback. A thoughtful finger pressed to her lips beneath slightly widened eyes, while Adelia sat forward, studying Elaine as if seeing her for the first time. Channeling, Elaine floated one of the tall armchairs to her and sat, composing her skirts. You may as well sit, too, Marillilla. She still used the voice of command. Apparently it was the only way to make them listen, but she was startled when Marillilla actually sank back down slowly, staring at her pop-eyed. Outside, she maintained a calm, cool facade, but inside anger bubbled. No, it boiled. Secrets. She'd always thought Aes Sedai kept too many secrets, even from each other, especially from each other. True, she kept some herself, but only at necessity, and not from anyone who needed to know. And these women had thought to punish her. Your authority comes from the hall of the tower, Marillilla. Nynaeve's and mine from the Amerlin seat. Ours supersedes yours. From now on, you will take your instructions from Nynaeve or me. We will, of course, listen carefully to any advice you might offer. She had thought Marililla's eyes bulged before, but now... Impossible! The Grey spluttered. You are Marillilla, Elaine said sharply, leaning forward. Do you still deny the authority of your Amerlin? Do you still dare? Marililla's mouth worked soundlessly. She wet her lips. She shook her head jerkily. Elaine felt a thrill of exultation. All that about Marillilla taking direction was stuff and nonsense, of course, but she would be acknowledged. Tom and her mother both said you must begin by asking for 10 to get 1. Still, that was not enough to damp her anger. She had half a mind to fetch a slipper herself and see how far she could push this. Except that would shatter everything. They would remember her age fast enough then, and how short a time ago she had put off a novice dress. They might even begin thinking of her as a foolish child again, which thought stoked her fury anew. But she contented herself with, while you think quietly on what else I should be told as Aes Sedai, Marillilla, Adelius and Vandine will instruct me in this secret I endangered. Do you mean to tell me the tower has known of the circle, these kin, as you call them, all along? Poor Rihanna and her hopes to avoid Aes Sedai notice. As near as they could make themselves come to sisters, I suppose, Vandine replied, carefully. She studied Elaine as intently as her sister did now. Though a green, she had many of the same mannerisms as Adelius. Cariana and Saritha looked stunned. disbelieving eyes swinging from a silent, red-cheeked Marililla to Elaine and back. Even during the Trolloc Wars, women failed their tests, or lacked the strength, or were sent away from the tower for any of the usual reasons. Adelius had adopted a lecturing tone, but not offensively. Browns often did when expounding. Under the circumstances, it is hardly surprising that a number feared to go off into the world alone, nor that they might flee to Barashta, as the city that existed here then was called. Though the main part of Barashta was, of course, where the Rahad now stands. Not that a stone of Barashta remains. The Trolloc Wars did not truly envelop Iharon until late, but in the end, Barashta fell as completely as Barcine, or Shamal, or the kin. Vandine broke in gently. Adelius blinked at her, then nodded. The kin persisted even after Barashta fell, in the same way they had before, taking in Wilders and women put out of the tower. Elaine frowned. Mistress Annan had said the kin took in Wilders too, but Rihanna's biggest anxiety had seemed to be making her and Nynaeve prove they were not. None ever remained long, Adelius added. 5 years, perhaps 10. Then, I suppose, as now. Once they realize that their little group is no replacement for the White Tower, they go off and become village healers or wisdoms or the like, or sometimes simply forget the power, stop channeling and take up a craft or trade. In any case, they vanish, so to speak. Elaine wondered how anyone could forget the one power that way. The urge to channel, the temptation of the source, was always there, once you learned how. Aes Sedai did seem to believe some women could just put it behind them, though, once they found out they would not be Aes Sedai. Vandine took up the explanation again. The sisters frequently spoke almost in alternating sentences, each carrying on smoothly where the other left off. The tower has known of the kin from nearly the beginning, perhaps from the very beginning. At first, no doubt, the wars took precedence, and despite calling themselves the kin, they have done just what we want such women to do. They remain hidden. Even the fact that they can channel, draw no attention whatsoever to themselves. Over the years, they've even passed along word, secretly, of course, carefully, when one of them found a woman falsely claiming the shawl. You said something? Elaine shook her head. Cariana, is there any tea in that pot? Cariana gave a small start. I think Adelius and Vandine might like to wet their throats. The Damani woman did not quite look at a still staring Marililla before going to the table where the silver teapot and cups were. That doesn't explain why, Elaine went on. Why is knowledge of them such a deep secret? Why haven't they been scattered long ago? Why, the runaways, of course. Adelius made it sound the most obvious thing in the world. It is a fact that other gatherings have been broken up as soon as found, the last about 200 years ago, but the kin do keep themselves small and quiet. That last group called themselves the Daughters of Silence, yet they were hardly silent. Only 23 of them altogether, Wilders gathered and trained after a fashion by a pair of former accepted, but they... Runaways, Elaine prompted, taking a cup from Cariana with a smile of thanks. She had not asked one for herself, but she realized absently that the woman had offered her the first. Vandine and her sister had talked quite a bit about runaways on the way to Ebudar. Adelius blinked and pulled herself back to the topic. The kin help runaways. They always have 2 or 3 women in Tarvalon keeping watch. For one thing, they approach almost every woman put out in a very circumspect way, and for another, they manage to find every runaway, whether novice or accepted. At least none has made it off the island without their help since the Trolloc Wars. Oh, yes, Vandine said as Adelius paused to take a cup from Cariana. It had been offered to Marililla first, but Marililla sat slumped and staring bleakly at nothing. If anyone does manage to escape, why, we know right where to look, and she nearly always ends up back in the tower wishing her feet had never itched. as long as the kin don't
Night.
know
Have
we
a good
know
night,
anything.
Shaws.
Once
And
that
definitely
happens, it will
appreciate
be
you
back to the
stopping
days
by.
before the kin, when a woman running from the tower might go in any direction. The numbers were larger then. Aes Sedai, accepted, novices and runaways. And some years, 2 out of 3 escaped clean. Others, 3 out of 4. Using the kin, we retake at least 9 of 10. You can see why the tower has preserved the kin and their secret like precious jewels. Elaine could. A woman was not done with the White Tower until it was done with her. Besides, it could not hurt the tower's reputation for infallibility that it always caught runaways. Almost always. Well, now she knew. She stood, and to her astonishment, Adelius did also, and Vandine, waving away Cariana's offered tea, and Saritha. Even Marililla, after a moment. They all looked at her expectantly, even Marililla. Vandine noticed her surprise and smiled. Another thing you might not know. We are a contentious lot in many ways, we Aes Sedai, each jealous of her place and prerogatives. But when someone is placed above us or stands above us, we tend to follow her fairly meekly for the most part, however we might grumble about her decisions in private. Why, so we do, Adelius murmured happily, as if she had just discovered something. Marililla took a deep breath, absorbing herself for a moment in straightening her skirts. Vandine is right, she said. You stand above us in yourself, and I must admit you apparently have been placed above us. If our behavior calls for penance, well, you will tell us if it does. Where are we to follow you, if I may ask? There was no sarcasm in any of that. If anything, her tone was more polite than Elaine had heard out of her before. She thought any Aes Sedai who ever lived would have been proud to control her features as well as she did right then. All she had wanted was for them to admit she really was Aes Sedai. She fought a momentary urge to protest that she was too young, too inexperienced. You can never put honey back in the comb, so Lini used to say when she was a girl. Egwene was no older. Drawing breath, she smiled warmly. The first thing to recall is that we are all sisters, in every meaning of the word. We must work together. The Bowl of the Winds is too important for anything less. She hoped they would all nod so
Hold on a second, I will
enthusiastically
be
when she
right
told
back.
them what Egwene intended. Perhaps we should sit again. They waited for her before folding themselves back into their seats. She hoped Nynaeve was getting on a 10th so well. When she found out about this, Nynaeve was going to faint from shock. I have something of my own to tell you about the kin. Fairly soon it was Marililla who looked ready to faint from shock, and even Adelius and Vandine were not far from it. But they went right on saying, "Yes, Elaine, and if you say so, Elaine." Perhaps it would all go smoothly from now on. The sedan chair was rocking through the crowds of revelers along the quay when Moghedien spotted the woman. She was being handed down from a coach at one of the boat landings by a footman in green and white. A wide, feathered mask covered her face more completely than Moghedien's did, but she would have known that determined stride, known that woman, from any angle in any light. The carved screens that served as windows in the closed chair were certainly no hindrance. 2 fellows with swords on their hips scrambled from the coach roof to follow the masked woman. Moghedien thumped a fist against the side of the chair, shouting, "Stop!" The bearers halted so quickly she was almost flung forward. The crowd jostled past, some shouting curses at her bearers for blocking the way, some shouting more good-naturedly. Down here by the river, the throng ran thin enough for her to watch through the gaps. The boat that pulled away from the landing seemed quite distinctive. The roof of the low cabin in the rear was painted red. She did not see that affectation on any of the others waiting at the long stone dock. She wet her lips, shivering. Moradin's instructions had been explicit, the price of disobedience made excruciatingly clear. But a slight delay would not hurt. Not if he never learned of it, anyway. Flinging open the door, she climbed out into the street and looked about hastily. There, that inn, right overlooking the docks and the river. Lifting her skirts, she hurried away without the slightest fear anyone might hire her chair. Until she untied the webs of compulsion on them, the bearers would tell anyone who asked that they were engaged, and stand there until they died of hunger. A path opened ahead of her, men and women in feathered masks leaping aside before she reached them, leaping with screams and cries as they clutched where they thought they had been stabbed. As they had. There was no time to spin subtle webs on so many minds, but a flurry of needles woven of air did as well here. The stout innkeeper at the Oarsman's Pride nearly leaped too, at the sight of Mogedion striding into her common room in gloriously scarlet silk, worked with thread of gold, and black silk that glistened as richly as the gold. Her mask was a great spray of pitch-black feathers with a sharp black beak, a raven. That was Moradin's joke, his command, as was the dress, in fact. His colors were black and red, he said, and she would wear them while she served him. She was in livery, however elegant, and she could have killed everyone who saw her. Instead, she spun a hasty web on the round-cheeked innkeeper that jerked her up straight and made her eyes pop. No time for subtlety. At Mogedion's command to show her the roof, the woman ran up the railless stairs at the side of the room. It was unlikely any of the feather-draped drinkers saw anything unusual in the innkeeper's behavior, Mogedion thought with a small laugh. The Oarsman's Pride probably had never seen a patron of her quality before. On the flat roof, she quickly weighed the dangers of letting the innkeeper live versus those of killing her. Corpses had a way of pointing a finger eventually. If you wished to remain quietly hidden in the shadows, you did not kill unless you absolutely had to. Hastily, she adjusted the web of compulsion, told the woman to go down to her room to go to sleep, and forget ever having seen her. With the haste, it was possible the innkeeper might lose the whole day, or wake somewhat slower of wits than she had been. So much in Mogedion's life would have been so much easier had she possessed a better talent for compulsion. But in any case, the woman scurried away, eager to obey, and left her alone. As the door thumped down flat into the dirty white-tiled roof, Mogedion gasped at the sudden feel of fingers stroking her mind, palping her soul. Moradin did that sometimes. A reminder, he said, as if she needed any more. She almost looked around for him. Her skin pebbled as though at a sudden icy breeze. The touch vanished, and she shivered again. Coming or going, it did remind her. Moradin himself could appear anywhere at any time. Haste. Speeding to the low wall that surrounded the roof, she searched the river spread out below. Scores of boats of every size swept along on their oars between larger vessels, anchored or under sail. Most of the cabins of the sort she sought were plain wood, but there she saw a yellow roof, and there a blue, and there, in mid-river and heading southward fast, red. It had to be the right one. She could not take any more time here. She raised her hands, but as bale fire launched itself, something flashed around her and she jerked. Moradin had come. He was here, and he would... She stared at the pigeons fluttering away. Pigeons. She nearly spewed the contents of her stomach across the roof. A glance at the river made her snarl. Because she had jerked, the bale fire she meant to slice through cabin and passenger instead had sliced diagonally through the middle of the boat, about where the oarsman had stood and the bodyguards. Because the rowers had been burned out of the pattern before the bale fire struck, the two halves of the craft were now a good 100 paces back up the river. Then again, perhaps it was not a complete disaster, because that slice from the boat's center had gone at the same time the boatmen really died. The river had had minutes to rush in. The two parts of the boat sank out of sight in a great froth of bubbles, even as her eyes shifted to them, carrying their passenger to the depths. Suddenly, what she had done struck her. She had always moved in the dim places, always kept herself hidden, always... Any woman in the city who could channel would know someone had drawn a great deal of Saidar, if not for what. And any eye watching had seen that bar of liquid white fire sear across the afternoon. Fear gave her wings. Not fear. Terror. Gathering her skirts, she ran back down the stairs, ran through the common room, bumping into tables and careering off people trying to get out her way, ran into the street too frightened to think, battering a path through the crowd with her hands. "Run!" she shrieked, hurling herself into the sedan chair. Her skirts caught in the door. She ripped them free. "Run!" The bearers flung themselves into motion, tossing her about, but she did not care. She braced herself with fingers laced through the carved wooden swings and shook uncontrollably. He had not forgiven. He might forgive or even ignore her independent action here if she carried out his instructions swiftly, efficiently. That was her only hope. She was going to make Phaleon and Ispan crawl. Chapter 31. Bashiara. As the boat swept away from the landing, Nynaeve tossed her mask down beside her on the cushioned bench and slumped back with arms folded and braid gripped firmly, scowling at nothing, scowling at everything. Listening to the wind still told her a fierce storm was on the way, the kind that tore off roofs, flattened barns, and she almost wished the river would begin to kick up in waves right that minute. "If it isn't the weather, Nynaeve," she mimicked, "then you should be the one to go. The mistress of the ships might be insulted if we didn't send the strongest of us. They know Aes Sedai put great store in that." Bah! That had been Elaine. Except for the bah. Elaine just thought putting up with any amount of nonsense from Marililla would be preferable to facing Nesta again. Once you began badly with someone, it was hard to recover. Matt Cawthon was proof enough of that. And if they had gotten off any worse with Nesta Din Rhea's 2 moons, she would be sending the lot of them to fetch and carry. Horrible woman, she grumbled, shifting around on the seat cushions. Avienda had been no better when Nynaeve suggested she go to the sea folk. Those people had been fascinated by her. She pitched her voice high and finicky. Not at all like Avienda's, but the mood fit. "We will learn of this trouble when we learn, Nynaeve Almira. Perhaps I will learn something watching Jakim Cardine today." If not for the fact that nothing whatsoever frightened the Aiel woman, she would have thought Avienda fearful from her eagerness to spy on Cardine. A day standing in a hot street jostled by crowds was not amusing, and today would be worse with the festival. Nynaeve would have thought the woman would enjoy a nice, refreshing boat ride. The boat lurched. A nice, refreshing boat ride, she told herself. Nice, cool breezes on the bay. Moist breezes, not dry. The boat rolled. "Oh, blood and ashes," she moaned. Appalled, she clapped a hand over her mouth and drummed her heels against the front of the bench in righteous outrage. If she had to endure those sea folk for long, she would have as much filth coming off of her tongue as Matt did. She did not want to think about him. One more day folding her hands for that man, and she would yank every hair out of her head. Not that he had demanded anything unreasonable so far, but she kept waiting for him to. And he "No," she said firmly. "I want to settle my stomach, not rile it." The boat had become slow rocking. She tried to concentrate on her clothes. She was not fixated on clothes, the way Elaine sometimes seemed to be, but thinking about silks and laces was soothing. Everything had been chosen to impress the mistress of the ships, to try regaining a little ground for all the good it might do. Green silk slashed with yellow in the skirts, embroidered in gold down the sleeves and across the bodice, with golden lace along the hem and at her wrists.
That's a
Just
good one to
ordering the
play
neckline.
to get the
Perhaps that
feel
should have
for
been
it.
higher to be taken seriously, but she did not own anything higher. Considering sea folk customs, it was more than modest. Nesta would have to take her as she was. Nynaeve Almira did not go changing herself for anyone. The yellow
My
opal pins
brother's
stuck
got
in her
that
braid
game.
were her own. A
He does
present
a lot
from
of
the
that
Canarch of
online
Tarbon,
play.
no less. But Tylin had provided the gold necklace that fanned emeralds and pearls down to her bosom. A richer piece than she had ever dreamed of owning. A gift for bringing Matt, Tylin had called it, which made no sense at all. But maybe the Queen thought she needed some excuse for such a valuable present. Both gold and ivory bracelets came from Avienda, who had a surprising little stock of jewelry for a woman who so seldom wore more than that one silver necklace. Nynaeve had asked to borrow that pretty roses and thorns ivory bracelet that the Aiel woman never wore. Surprisingly, Avienda had snatched it to her bosom as if it was her most precious possession, and of all things, Elaine began comforting her. Nynaeve would not have been surprised to see the pair fall weeping on one another's shoulder.
Well, I'll put mine
There was
down. I
something
can't
odd going on there,
remember
and if she
my
had not
brothers.
known those two were too sensible for such nonsense,
But here's
she
mine.
would have suspected a man at the root of it. Well, Avienda was too sensible. Elaine did still yearn for Rand, though Nynaeve could hardly fault her, for suddenly she felt waves of Sidar almost atop her in huge amounts, and
There's mine.
she floundered in salty water over her head, flailing upward to find air, tangled in her skirts, flailing. Her head broke surface, and she gasped for breath amid floating cushions, staring in astonishment. After a moment, she recognized the slanting shape above her as one of the cabin seats and a bit of the cabin wall. She was inside a trapped pocket of air. Not large. She could have touched both sides without stretching her arms out fully. But how? An audible thud announced the bottom of the river. The upside-down cabin lurched, tilted. She thought that her heart shrank a little. The first order of business before wondering about anything was getting out before she used up the air. She knew how to swim. She had splashed in the waterwood ponds often enough back home. It was just when the water started rocking about her that she minded. Filling her lungs, she doubled over and swam down toward where the door must be, kicking awkwardly because of her skirts. It might help to shed the dress, but she was not about to bob to the surface of the river in nothing but shift and stockings and jewels. She was not about to leave those behind either. Besides, she could not get out of the dress without losing her belt pouch, and she would drown before losing what was in there. The water was black, lightless. Her outstretched fingers struck wood, and she felt across the piercework carving until she found the door, scrabbled down the edge of that, and found a hinge. Muttering imprecations in her head, she cautiously felt her way to the other side. Yes! The latch handle! She lifted it, pushed outward. The door moved maybe 2 inches, and stopped. Lungs straining, she swam back up to the pocket, but only long enough to fill them again. This time, finding the door came faster. She stuck her fingers through the crack to find what held the door shut. They sank into mud. Maybe she could dig away a little hillock, or she felt higher, more mud. Increasingly frantic, she worked her fingers from the bottom to the top, and then refusing to believe from the top to the bottom. Mud. Solid, gooey mud all the way. This time, when she swam back up to the pocket, she grabbed hold of the edge of the seat above her and hung from it, panting, heart beating wildly. The air felt thicker. "I will not die here," she muttered. "I will not die here." She hammered a fist against the seat until she felt it bruise, fighting for the anger that would allow her to channel. She would not die. Not here. Alone. No one would know where she had died. No grave. Just a corpse rotting at the bottom of the river. Her arm fell with a splash. She labored for breath. Flecks of black and silver danced in her eyes. She seemed to be looking down a tube. No anger, she realized dimly. She kept trying to reach for Saidar, but without any belief that she would touch it now. She was going to die here after all. No hope, no lamp. And with hope gone, flickering on the edge of consciousness like a guttering candle flame, she did something she had never done before in her life. She surrendered completely. Saidar flowed into her, filled her. She was only half aware of the wood above her suddenly bulging outward, bursting. In rushing bubbles of air, she drifted up, out through the hole in the hull into darkness. Vaguely, she knew she should do something. She could almost remember what. Yes, her feet kicked weakly. She tried to move her arms to swim. They seemed to just float. Something seized her dress, and panic roused her in thoughts of sharks and lionfish, and the light alone knew what else that might inhabit these black depths. A spark of consciousness spoke of the power, but she flailed desperately with fists and feet, felt her knuckles land solidly. Unfortunately, she also screamed, or tried to. A great quantity of water rushing down her throat washed away scream, side-arm, and very nearly her final scraps of awareness. Something tugged on her braid, then again, and she was being towed somewhere. She was no longer conscious enough to struggle, or even to be very much afraid of being eaten. Abruptly, her head broke surface. Hands encircled her from behind. Hands, not a shark after all, squeezed hard against her ribs in a most familiar way. She coughed. Water spewed from her nose, coughed again, painfully, and drew a shuddering breath. She had never tasted anything so sweet in her life. A hand cupped her chin, and suddenly she was being towed again. Lassitude washed through her. All she could do was float on her back and breathe and stare up at the sky. So blue, so beautiful. The stinging in her eyes was not all from the salty river. And then she was being pushed upward against the side of a boat, a rude hand beneath her bottom shoving her higher until two lanky fellows with brass rings in their ears could reach down and haul her aboard. They helped her walk a step or two, but as soon as they let go to help her rescue her legs collapsed like towers of soggy mush. On unsteady hands and knees, she stared blankly at a sword and boots and green coat someone had thrown down on the deck. She opened her mouth and emptied herself of the River Elbar. The entire river, it seemed, plus her midday meal and her breakfast. It would not have surprised her at all to see a few fish, or her slippers. She was wiping her lips with the back of her hand when she became aware of voices. "My lord is all right. My lord was down for a very long time." "Forget me, man," said a deep voice. "Get something to wrap around the lady." Lan's voice that she dreamed every night of hearing. Wide-eyed, Nynaeve barely bit back a wail. The horror she had felt when she thought she was going to die was nothing alongside what flashed through her now. Nothing. This was a nightmare. Not now. Not like this. Not when she was a drowned rat, kneeling with the contents of her stomach spread out before her. Without thought, she embraced Saidar and channeled. Water fell away from her clothes, her hair, in a rush, and washed all evidence of her little mishap out through a scupper hole. Scrambling to her feet, she hurriedly pulled her necklace aright and did her best to straighten her dress and hair, but the soaking in salt water and then the rapid drying had left several stains on the silk, and a number of creases that would require a knowledgeable hand with a hot iron to remove. Wisps of hair wanted to fly away from her scalp, and the opals in her braid seemed to dot the bristling tail of an angry cat. It did not matter. She was calmness itself, cool as an early spring breeze, self-possessed as... She spun around before he could come on her from behind and startle her into disgracing herself completely. She only realized how quickly she had moved when she saw that Lan was just then taking his second step from the railing. He was the most beautiful man she'd ever seen. Soaking wet in shirt and breeches and stockings, he was gorgeous, with his dripping hair clinging to the angles of his face, and a split purple bruise was rising on his face as from a blow. She clapped a hand to her mouth, remembering her fist connecting. "Oh, no. Oh, Lan, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to." She was not really aware of crossing the space between them. She was just there, stretching up on tiptoes to lay fingers gently on his injury. A deft weave of all 5 powers, and his tanned cheek was unblemished. but he might have been hurt elsewhere. She spun the weaves to delve him. New scars made her wince inside, and there was something odd, but he seemed healthy as a prime bull. He was also very wet from saving her. She dried him as she had herself. Water splashed around his feet. She could not stop touching him. Both hands traced his hard cheeks, his wonderful blue eyes, his strong nose, his firm lips, his ears. She combed that silky black hair into place with her fingers, adjusted the braided leather band that held it. Her tongue seemed to have a life of its own, too. "Oh, Lan," she murmured, "you really are here?" Somebody giggled. Not her. Nynaeve Almira did not giggle, but somebody did. "It isn't a dream. Oh, Light, you're here. How?" "A servant at the Tarasin Palace told me you'd gone to the river, and a fellow at the landing said what boat you had taken. If Mandarb hadn't lost a shoe, I would have been here yesterday." "I don't care. You're here now. You're here." She did not giggle. "Maybe she is Aes Sedai," one of the boatmen murmured, not quite low enough, "but I still say she's one duckling who means to stuff herself in that wolf's jaws." Nynaeve's face flashed pure scarlet, and she snatched her hands to her sides, her heels thumping to the deck. Another time she would have given the fellow what for, and no mistake. Another time, when she could think. Lan crowded everything else out of her head. She seized his arm. "We can talk more privately in the cabin." Had one of the oarsmen snickered? "My sword." "I'll bring it," she said, snatching up his things from the deck on flows of air. One of those louts had snickered. Another flow of air pulled open the cabin door, and she hustled Lan and his sword and the rest inside and slammed it behind them. Light! She doubted if even Callie Copland back home had ever been as bold as this, and as many merchants' guards knew Callie's birthmark as knew her face. But it was not the same at all. Not at all. Still, no harm in being just a tad less eager. Her hands went back to his face, only to straighten his hair some more. Just that, and he caught her wrists gently in his big hands. "Mirella holds my bond now," he said quietly. "She is lending me to you until you find a warder of your own." Calmly pulling her right hand free, she slapped his face as hard as she could swing. His head hardly moved, so she freed the other hand and slapped him harder with that. "How could you?" For good measure, she punctuated the question with another slap. "You knew I was waiting." One more seemed called for, just to drive the point home. "How could you do such a thing? How could you let her?" Another slap. "Burn you, Lan Mandragoran! Burn you! Burn you! Burn you to the pit of doom! Burn you!" The man, the bloody man, did not say one word. Not that he could, of course. What defense could he offer? He just stood there while she rained blows at him, making no move, unblinking eyes looking peculiar, as well they might with the way she reddened his cheeks for him. If her slaps made little impression on him, though, the palms of her hands began to sting like fury. Grimly, she clenched a fist and punched him in the belly with all her might. He grunted, slightly. "We will talk this over calmly and rationally," she said, stepping back from him, "as adults." Lan just nodded and sat down and pulled his boots over to him. Pushing bits of hair out of her face with her left hand, she stuck the right behind her so she could flex her sore fingers without him seeing. He had no right being that hard, not when she wanted to hit him. Too much to hope she had cracked a rib in him. "You should thank her, Nynaeve." How could the man sound so calm? Stamping his foot firmly into one boot, he bent to pick up the other, not looking at her. "You wouldn't want me bonded to you." The flow of air seized a handful of his hair and bent his head up painfully. If you even dare to spout that drivel about not wanting to give me a widow's weeds, Lan Mandragoran, I'll... She could not think of anything strong enough. Kicking him was not near enough. Mirella. Mirella and her warders. Burn him. Removing his hide in strips would not be enough. He might as well not have been bent over with his neck craned. He just rested his forearms across his knees and watched her with that odd look in his eyes and said, "I thought about not telling you, but you have a right to know." Even so, his tone became hesitant. Lan was never hesitant. When Moiraine died, when a warder's bond to his Aes Sedai is snapped, there are changes. As he continued, her arms snaked around herself, hugging tightly to keep her from shivering. Her jaw ached, for she kept it clamped shut. She released the flow holding him as if a hand springing away released Saidar, but he only straightened and went on relating this horror without so much as a flinch, went on watching her. Suddenly she understood his eyes, colder than winter's heart. The eyes of a man who knew he was dead and could not make himself care. A man waiting, almost eager, for that long sleep. Her own eyes stung with not weeping. "So you see," he concluded with a smile that touched only his mouth, an accepting smile. "When it's done, she will have a year or more of pain, and I will still be dead. You are spared that. My last gift to you, Mashiara." Mashiara, his lost love. "You are to be my warder until I find one?" Her voice startled her with its levelness. She could not break down in tears now. She would not. Now, more than ever before, she had to gather all her strength. "Yes," he said cautiously, tugging on his other boot. He'd always seemed something of a half-tame wolf, and his eyes made him seem much less than half-tame now. "Good." Adjusting her skirts, she resisted the urge to cross the cabin to him. She could not let him see her fear. "Because I have found him. You. I waited and wished with Moiraine. I won't with Mirella. She is going to give me your bond." Mirella would if she had to drag the woman to Tar Valon and back by her hair. For that matter, she might drag her just for the principle of it. "Don't say anything," she said sharply when he opened his mouth. Her fingers brushed her belt pouch, where his heavy gold signet ring lay wrapped in a silk handkerchief. With an effort, she moderated her tone. He was ill, and harsh words never helped sickness. It was an effort, though. She wanted to berate him up one side and down the other, wanted to pull her braid out by the roots every time she thought of him and that woman. Fighting to keep her voice calm, she went on. "In the Two Rivers land, when somebody gives another a ring, they are betrothed." That was a lie, and she half expected him to jump to his feet in outrage, but he only blinked warily. Besides, she had read about the notion in a story. "We have been betrothed long enough. We are going to be married today." "I used to pray for that," he said softly, then shook his head. "You know why it can't be, Nynaeve. And even if it could, Mirella..." Despite all her promises to keep her temper, to be gentle, she embraced Saidar and stuffed a gag of air into his mouth before he could confess what she did not want to hear. So long as he did not confess, she could pretend nothing had happened. When she got hold of Mirella, though, opals pressed hard into her palm, and her hand leaped from her braid as if burned. She occupied her fingers with brushing his hair again, while he glared at her indignantly above his gaping mouth. "A small lesson for you in the difference between wives and other women," he said lightly. "Such a struggle. I would appreciate it very much if you did not mention Mirella's name again in my presence. Do you understand?" He nodded, and she released the flow, but as soon as he had worked his jaw a moment, he said, "Naming no names, Nynaeve, you know she's aware of everything I feel through the bond. If we were man and wife..." She thought her face might burst into flame. She had never thought of that. Bloody Mirella. "Is there any way to make sure she knows it is me?" she said finally, and her cheeks nearly did flash to fire. Especially when he fell back against the cabin wall, laughing in astonishment. "Light, Nynaeve. You are a hawk. Light. I haven't laughed since..." His mirth faded, the coldness that had dimmed in his eyes for an instant returning. I do wish it could be, Nynaeve, but it can and will, she broke in. Men always seem to get the upper hand if you let them talk too long. She plumped herself down on his knees. They were not married yet, true, but he was softer than the unpadded benches on this boat. She shifted a bit to make herself more comfortable. Well, no harder than the benches, anyway. You might as well reconcile yourself, Landman Dragarin. My heart belongs to you, and you've admitted yours belongs to me. You belong to me, and I will not let you go. You will be my warder and my husband, and for a very long time. I will not let you die. Do you understand that? I can be as stubborn as I have to be. I hadn't noticed, he said, and her eyes narrowed. His tone sounded awfully dry. As long as you do now, she said firmly. Twisting her neck, she peered through the piercework in the hull behind him, then craned around to peer through the carving at the front of the cabin. Long stone docks thrusting out from the stone quay passed by. All she could see ahead were more docks, and the city gleaming white in the afternoon sun. Where are we going? She muttered. I told them to put us ashore as soon as I had you aboard, Lan said. It seemed best to get off the river as fast as possible. You? She clamped her teeth shut. He had not known where she was headed or why. He had done the best he could with what he did know, and he had saved her life. I can't go back to the city yet, Lan. Clearing her throat, she changed her tone. However gentle she had to be with him, that much syrup would make her sick up all over again. I have to go to the sea folk ships, to Windrunner. Much better. Light, but not too light, and firm. Nynaeve, I was right behind your boat. I saw what happened. You were 50 paces ahead of me, and they were 50 paces behind, sinking. It had to be balefire. He did not need to say more. She said it for him, and with more knowledge than he had. Gideon, she breathed. Oh, it could have been another of the Forsaken, or one of the Black Ajah, perhaps, but she knew. Well, she had beaten Mogedion not once, but twice. She could do so a third time, if necessary. Her face must not have shared her confidence. Don't be afraid, Lan said, touching her cheek. Don't ever be afraid while I'm near. If you have to face Mogedion, I'll make sure you are angry enough to channel. I seem to have some talent in that direction. You'll never make me angry again, she began, and stopped, staring at him wide-eyed. I'm not angry, she said slowly. Not now, but when you need to be. I'm not angry, she laughed. She kicked her feet into light and pounded her fists on his chest, laughing. Saidar filled her, not just with life and joy, but this time with awe. With feathery flows of air, she stroked his cheeks. I am not angry, Lan, she whispered. Your block is gone. He grinned, sharing her delight, but the grin put no warmth into his eyes. I will take care of you, Landman Dragarin, she promised silently. I will not let you die. Leaning on his chest, she thought of kissing him, and even... You are not Callie Coplin, she told herself firmly. A sudden horrible thought struck her, all the more horrible because it had not come earlier. The boatmen, she said quietly. My bodyguards? Wordlessly he shook his head, and she sighed. Bodyguards. Like they had needed her protection, not the other way around. 4 more deaths to lay at Mogedion's feet. 4 on top of thousands, but these were personal as far as she was concerned. Well, she was not about to settle Mogedion this moment. Getting to her feet, she began seeing what she could do about her clothes. Lan, will you turn the boatmen around? Tell them to row for all they have. As it was, she would not see the palace again before nightfall. And find out if one of them has such a thing as a comb. She could not face Nesta like this. He picked up his coat and sword and gave her a bow. As you command, Aes Sedai. Pursing her lips, she watched the door close behind him. Laughing at her, was he? She would wager someone on Windrunner could perform a marriage, And from what she had seen of the sea folk, she would wager landman Dragarin would find himself promising to do as he was told. They would see who laughed then. Lurching and rolling, the boat began to swing around, and her stomach lurched with it. Oh, light, she groaned, sinking onto the bench. Why could she not have lost that along with her block? Holding Sidar, aware of every touch of the air on her skin, only made it worse. Letting go did not help. She was not going to sick up again. She was going to make Lan hers once and for all. This was going to be a wonderful day yet, if only she could stop feeling that storm was on the way. The sun sat luridly just above the rooftops by the time Elaine rapped on the door with her knuckles. Revelers danced and cavorted in the street behind her, filling the air with laughter and song and the scent of perfume. Idly, she wished she had had a chance really to enjoy the festival. A costume like Brigitta's might have been fun. Or even one like that she had seen on the Lady Brisella, one of Tyland's attendants, first thing this morning. As long as she could have kept her mask on. She rapped again, harder. The gray-haired, square-jawed maid opened the door, fury suddenly painting her face when Elaine lowered her green mask. You! What are you doing back? Fury turned to ghastly paleness as Marillilla removed her mask, and Adelius and the others did the same. The woman jerked with each ageless face revealed, and even with Saritha's. By that time, maybe she saw what she expected to see. With a sudden cry, the maid tried to push the door shut, but Brigitta darted past Elaine, her feathered shoulder knocking it back open. The servant staggered a few steps, then gathered herself, but whether to run or shout, Brigitta was there before time, gripping her arm below the shoulder. Easy, Brigitta said firmly. We don't want any fuss or shouting, now do we? It did seem she was only holding the woman's arm, almost supporting her, but the maid stood very straight indeed and very still. Staring wide-eyed at her captor's plume-crested mask, she shook her head slowly. What is your name? Elaine asked, as everyone crowded into the entry hall behind her. The closing door muted the noise from outside. The maid's eyes darted from one face to the next, as if she could not bear to gaze at anyone for long. Sidora. You will take us to the ride, Sidora. This time Sidora nodded. Sidora quickly led the way upstairs with Brigitta still holding her arm. Elaine considered telling her to release the woman, but the last thing she wanted was a shouted alarm and everyone in the house fleeing in all directions. That was why Brigitta used muscle instead of Elaine herself channeling. She thought Sidora was more frightened than hurt, and everybody was to be at least a little frightened this evening. In there, Sidora said, nodding to a red door. The door to the room where Nynaeve and she had had that unfortunate incident. She opened it and went in. Rihanna was there, seated with the fireplace carved with the 13 sins at her back, and so were another dozen women Elaine had never seen before, occupying all of the chairs against the pale green walls, sweating with the windows tight and curtains drawn. Most wore ebudari dresses, though only one possessed the olive skin. Most had lines on their faces and at least a touch of gray, and every last woman of them could channel to one degree or another. 7 wore the red belt. She sighed in spite of herself. When Nynaeve was right, she let you know it until you wanted to scream. Rihanna bounded to her feet in the same red-faced fury Sidora had shown, and her first words were almost identical as well. You! How dare you show your face? Words and fury drained away together for the same reason, too, as Marillilla and the others entered on Elaine's heels. A yellow-haired woman in red belt and plunging neckline made a faint sound as her eyes rolled up in her head, and she slid bonelessly from her red chair. No one moved to help her. No one even glanced at Brigitta as she escorted Sidora to a corner and planted her there. No one seemed to breathe. Elaine felt a great desire to shout, "Boo!" just to see what would happen. Rihanna swayed, white-faced, and visibly tried to gather herself with slight success. It took her only a moment to scan the 5 cool-faced Aes Sedai lined up before the door and decide who must be in charge. She wobbled across the floor tiles to Marililla and sank to her knees, head bowed. "Forgive us, Aes Sedai." Her voice was worshipful, and only a little steadier than her knees had been. She babbled, in fact. "We are only a few friends. We have done nothing, certainly nothing to bring discredit to Aes Sedai. I swear that, whatever this girl has told you. We would have told you of her, but we were afraid. We only meet to talk. She has a friend, Aes Sedai. Did you catch her too? I can describe her for you, Aes Sedai. Whatever you wish we will do. I swear we—" Marililla cleared her throat loudly. "Your name is Rihanna Corley, I believe?" Rihanna flinched and whispered that it was, still peering at the floor at the Grey Sister's feet. "I fear you must address yourself to Elaine Sedai, Rihanna." Rihanna's head jerked up in a most satisfactory way. She stared at Marililla, then by slow increments turned eyes as big as her face to Elaine. She licked her lips. She drew a deep, long breath. Twisting around on her knees to face Elaine, she bowed her head once more. "I beg your forgiveness, Aes Sedai," she said leadenly. "I did not know. I could not—" Another long, hopeless breath. "Whatever punishment you decree, we accept humbly, of course. But please, I beg you to believe that—" "Oh, stand up," Elaine broke in impatiently. She'd wanted to make this woman acknowledge her as much as she had Marililla or any of the others, but the groveling sickened her. "That's right. Stand on your feet." She waited until Rihanna complied, then walked over and sat in the woman's chair. There was no need for cringing, but she wanted no doubts who was in charge. "Do you still deny knowledge of the Bowl of the Winds, Rihanna?" Rihanna spread her hands. "Aes Sedai," she said guilelessly. "None of us would ever use a ter'angreal, much less an angreal or sa'angreal." Guileless and wary as a fox in a city. "I assure you we make no pretense of being anything even near to Aes Sedai. We are just these few friends you see, tied together by once having been allowed to enter the White Tower. That is all." "Just these few friends," Elaine said dryly over steepled fingers. "And Garinia, of course, and Barrowen, and Delise, and Elise." "Yes," Rihanna said reluctantly. "And them." Elaine shook her head very slowly. "Rihanna, the White Tower knows about your kin. The Tower has always known." A dark woman with a Tyran looked to her, though wearing a blue and white silk vest with the sigil of the Goldsmiths' Guild, gave a strangled scream and pressed both plump hands to her mouth. A lean, graying Saldaean wearing the red belt crumpled with a sigh to join the yellow-haired woman on the floor, and 2 more swayed as if they might. For her part, Rihanna looked at the sisters in front of the door for confirmation and saw it, as she thought. Marililla's face was more icy than serene, and Saritha grimaced before she could stop herself. Vandine and Cariana were both tight-lipped, and even Adelius seemed included, turning her head this way and that to study the women along the walls as she might have insects previously unknown to her. Of course, what Rihanna saw and what was were not the same. They had all accepted Elaine's decision, but no amount of "yes, Elaine" could make them like it. They would have been here 2 hours ago if not for a great deal of "but Elaine" tossed in. Sometimes leading meant herding. Rihanna did not faint, but fear filled her face, and she raised pleading hands. "Do you mean to destroy the kin? Why now, after so long? What have we done that you should come down on us now?" "No one will destroy you," Elaine told her. "Cariana, since nobody else is going to help those 2, would you, please?" Jumps and blushes ran around the room, and before Cariana could move, 2 women were crouching over each one who had fainted, lifting her up and waving smelling salts under her nose. "The Amerlin seat desires every woman who can channel to be connected to the Tower," Elaine went on. "The offer is open to any of the kin who wish to accept." Had she woven flows of air around every one of those women, she could not have frozen them more still. Had she squeezed those flows tight, she could not have produced more bulging eyes. One of the women who had fainted suddenly gasped and coughed, pushing away the tiny vial of salts that had been held still too long. That broke everyone free in a deluge of voices. "We can become Aes Sedai after all?" the tyrant in the goldsmith's vest asked excitedly, at the same time that a round-faced woman with a red belt at least twice as long as anyone else's burst out with, "They will let us learn? They will teach us again?" A deluge of painfully eager voices. "We can really?" and "They will let us?" from every side. Rihanna rounded on them fiercely. "Ivara, Sumeko, all of you, you forget yourselves. You speak in front of Aes Sedai. You speak in front of Aes Sedai." She passed a hand over her face, trembling. An embarrassed silence descended. Eyes fell and blushes rose. With all those lined faces, all that gray and white hair, Elaine still was minded of nothing so much as a group of novices having a pillow fight after last had told when the mistress of novices walked in. Hesitantly, Rihanna looked at her across her fingertips. "We truly will be allowed to return to the tower," she mumbled into her hand. Elaine nodded. "Those who can learn to become Aes Sedai will have the chance, and there will be a place for all. For any woman who can channel." Unshed tears shone in Rihanna's eyes. Elaine was not sure, but she thought the woman whispered, "I can be green." It was hard not to rush over and throw her arms around her. None of the other Aes Sedai showed any signs of giving way to emotion, and Marillilla certainly was of sterner stuff. "If I may ask a question, Elaine. Rihanna, how many of you will we be taking in?" Doubtless that pause covered a change from how many Wilders and failures. If Rihanna noticed or suspected, she ignored it or did not care. "I cannot believe there are any who would refuse the offer," she said breathlessly. "It may take some time to send word to everyone. We remain spread out, you see, so—" She laughed, a touch nervously and still not far from tears. "So Aes Sedai would not notice us. At present there are 1,783 names on the roll." Most Aes Sedai learned to cover shock with an outward show of calm, and only Saritha allowed her eyes to widen. She also mouthed silent words, but Elaine knew her well enough to read her lips. 2,000 Wilders, light help us. Elaine made a great show of adjusting her skirts until she was sure her own face was under control. Light help them indeed. Rihanna misunderstood the silence. "You expected more? Accidents do take some every year, or natural deaths, as with everyone else, and I fear the kin have grown fewer in the last 1,000 years. Perhaps we have been too cautious in approaching women when they leave the White Tower, but there has always been the fear that one of them might report being questioned, and we are not disappointed in the least," Elaine assured her, making soothing gestures. "Disappointed?" She giggled hysterically. "There were twice as many kinswomen as there were Aes Sedai." Egwene could never say she had not done her part to bring women who could channel to the tower. But if the kin refused Wilders, she must stick to the point. Conscripting the kin had only been incidental. "Rihanna," she said gently, "do you think perhaps you might happen to recall where the Bowl of the Winds is now?" Rihanna blushed a sunset. "We've never touched them," Elaine said. I don't know why they were gathered. I've never heard of this Bowl of the Winds, but there is a storeroom such as you describe over—" Below stairs a woman channeled briefly. Someone screamed in purest terror. Elaine was on her feet in a flash, as were they all. From somewhere in that feathered dress, Brigitte produced a dagger. "That must have been Darice," Rihanna said. "She's the only other one here." Elaine darted forward and caught her arm as she started for the door. "You aren't green yet," she murmured, and was rewarded with a lovely dimpled smile, surprised and pleased and diffident all at once. We will handle this, Rihanna. Marililla and the others arrayed themselves to either side, ready to follow Elaine out, but Brigitta was at the door before any of them, grinning as she put hand to latch. Elaine swallowed and said nothing. That was the warder's honor, so the guidine said. First to go in, last to come out. But she still filled herself with cider, ready to crush anything that threatened her warder. The door opened before Brigitta could lift the latch. Matt sauntered in, pushing the slender maid Elaine remembered ahead of him. "I thought you might be here." He grinned insolently, ignoring Derise's glares, and went on. "When I found a bloody great lot of warders drinking at my least favorite tavern, I've just come back from following a woman to the Rahad, to the top floor of a house with nobody living on it, to be precise. After she'd left, the floor was so dusty I could see right away which room she'd gone to. There's a flaming big rusted lock on the door, but I'll bet 1,000 crowns to a kick in the bottom your bold is behind it." Derise aimed a kick at him, and he pushed her away, pulling a small knife from his belt to bounce on his palm. "Will one of you tell this wildcat watchdog whose side I'm on? Women with knives make me uneasy these days." "We already know all about that, Matt," Elaine said. Well, they had been just about to learn all about it, and the stunned look on his face was priceless. She felt something from Brigitta. The other woman gazed at her without any particular expression, but that little knot of emotion in the back of Elaine's head radiated disapproval. Avienda probably would not think much of it either. Opening her mouth was one of the most difficult things Elaine had ever done. "I must thank you, though, Matt. It is entirely due to you that we have found what we were looking for." His gaping astonishment was almost worth the agony. He closed his mouth quickly, though opening it again to say, "Then let's hire a boat and fetch this bloody bowl. With any luck we can leave Ebudar tonight." "That is ridiculous, Matt. And don't tell me I'm demeaning you. We are not crawling about the Rahad in the dark, and we are not leaving Ebudar until we have used the bowl." He tried to argue, of course, but Derise took the opportunity of his attention being elsewhere to try kicking him again. He dodged around Brigitta, yelping for somebody to help him, while the slender woman darted after him. "He is your warder, Elaine Sedai?" Rihanna asked doubtfully. "Light, no. Brigitta is." Rihanna's mouth fell open. Having answered a question, Elaine asked one, a question she could not have brought herself to ask another sister. "Rihanna, if you don't mind telling me, how old are you?" The woman hesitated, glancing at Matt, but he was still dodging to keep a grinning Brigitta between him and Derise. "My next naming day," Rihanna said, as if it was the most ordinary thing in the world, "will be my 412th. Marililla fainted dead away. Chapter 32. Sealed to the Flame. Elida Doavrinia Royhan sat regally in the Amerlin seat, the tall vine-carved chair painted now in only 6 colors instead of 7, a 6-striped stole on her shoulders, and ran her gaze around the circular hall of the tower. The sitters' painted chairs had been rearranged along the stair-fronted dais that encircled the chamber beneath the great dome, spaced out to account for only 6 ajas instead of 7 now, and 18 sitters stood obediently. Young Althor knelt quietly beside the Amerlin seat. He would not speak unless given leave, which he would not receive today. Today he was merely another symbol of her power, and the 12 most favored sitters glowed with the link that she herself controlled to keep him safe. "The greater consensus is achieved, Mother," Alviarin said meekly at her shoulder, bowing humbly against the flame-topped staff. Down on the floor below the dais, Shiriam screamed wildly and had to be restrained by the tower guard at her side. The Red Sister shielding her sneered in contempt. Romanda and Lelaine clung to a cold outward dignity, but most of the others shielded and guarded on the floor wept quietly, perhaps in relief that only 4 women had been given the ultimate penalty, perhaps in fear of what else was to come. The most ashen faces belonged to the three who had dared sit in a rebel hall for the now dissolved Blue. Every rebel had been cast out from her Aja until Elida granted permission to request reacceptance. But the one-time Blues knew they confronted difficult years working their way into her good graces, years before they would be allowed to enter any Aja at all. Until then, they lay in the palm of her hand. She stood, and it seemed the one power flowing through her from the circle was a manifestation of her power. The hall concurs with the will of the Amerlin seat. Let Romanda be the first to be birched. Romanda's head jerked. Let her see how much dignity she could retain until her stilling. Elida gestured curtly. Take the prisoners away, and bring in the first of the poor deluded sisters who followed them. I will accept their submission. There was a cry among the prisoners, and one tore free from the guard gripping her arm. Egwene Alvir threw herself onto the steps at Elida's feet, hands outstretched, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Forgive me, mother," the girl wept. "I repent. I will submit. I do submit. Please, do not still me." Brokenly, she sagged, face down, shoulders shaking with sobs. "Please, mother, I repent. I do." "The Amerlin seat can show mercy," Elida said exultantly. The White Tower had to lose Lelaine and Romanda and Shiriam as examples, but she could keep this girl's strength. She was the White Tower. "Egwene Alvir, you have rebelled against your Amerlin, but I will show mercy. You will be dressed in novice white again, until I myself judge you ready to be raised further. But this very day you shall be the first to take a fourth oath on the oath rod of fealty and obedience to the Amerlin seat." The prisoners began falling on their knees, crying out to be allowed to take that oath, to prove their true submission. Lelaine was one of the first, and neither Romanda nor Shiriam the last. Egwene crawled up the steps to kiss the hem of Elida's dress. "I yield myself to your will, mother," she murmured through her tears. "Thank you. Oh, thank you." Alviarin seized Elida's shoulder, shook her. "Wake up, you fool woman," she growled. Elida's eyes popped open to the dim light of a single lamp held by Alviarin, bending over her bed with a hand on her shoulder. Still only half awake, she mumbled, "What did you say?" "I said, please wake up, mother," Alviarin replied coolly. "The Baldine has returned from Kyrian." Elida shook her head, trying to clear away the tag end of the dream. "So soon? I did not expect them for another week at least. Kovarla, you say? Where is Galina?" Foolish questions. Alviarin would not know what she meant. But in that cool, crystalline tone, the woman said, "She believes Galina dead or a prisoner. I fear the news is not good." What Alviarin should or should not know rushed out of Elida's head. "Tell me," she demanded, throwing off the silk sheet. But as she rose and belted a silk robe over her nightdress, she heard only snatches. A battle. Hordes of Aiel women channeling. Althor gone. Disaster. Distractedly, she noticed that Alviarin was neatly garbed in a silver-embroidered white dress, with the keeper's stole around her neck. The woman had waited till she clothed herself to bring her this. The case clock in her study softly chimed second low as she entered the sitting room. The small hours of the morning, the worst time to receive dire news. Kovarla rose hastily from one of the red-cushioned armchairs, her implacable face sagging with weariness and worry, and knelt to kiss Elida's ring. Her dark riding dress still bore the dust of travel, and her pale hair needed a brush, but she had donned the shawl she had worn as long as Elida had been alive. Elida barely waited for the woman's lips to touch the great serpent before pulling her hand away. "Why were you sent?" she said curtly. Snatching up her knitting from where she had left it in a chair, she sat and began to work the long ivory needles. Knitting served many of the same purposes as fondling her carved ivory miniatures, and she surely needed soothing now. Knitting helped her think, too. She had to think. "Where is Katerina?" If Galina was dead, Katerina should have taken charge ahead of Koiran. Elida had made it clear that once Althor was taken, the Red Aja was in charge. Kovarla stood slowly, as if uncertain she should. Her hands tightened on the red-fringed shawl looped over her arms. Katerina is among the missing, Mother. I stand highest among those who... Her words trailed off, as Elida stared at her, fingers frozen in the act of passing wool over one of the needles. Kovarla swallowed and shifted her feet. How many, daughter? Elida asked finally. She could not believe her voice was so calm. I cannot say how many escaped, Mother, Kovarla said hesitantly. We dared not wait to make a thorough search, and... How many? Elida shouted. With a shudder, she made herself concentrate on her knitting. Giving way to anger was weakness. Loop the yarn, pull through, and push down. Soothing motions. I brought 11 other sisters with me, Mother. The woman paused, breathing hard, and then, when Elida said nothing, rushed on. Others may be making their way back, Mother. Gawain refused to wait longer, and we dared not remain without him and his younglings, not with so many Aiel about, and the... Elida did not hear. 12 returned. Had any more escaped, they would have sped back to Tarvalin, would have been here as soon as Kovarla, surely. Even if 1 or 2 were injured, traveling slowly. 12 out of 39. The tower had not suffered a disaster of this magnitude even during the Trolloc Wars. These Aiel wilders must be taught a lesson, she said, trampling over whatever Kovarla was babbling. Galena had thought she could use Aiel to divert Aiel. What a fool the woman had been. We will rescue the sisters they hold prisoner and teach them what it means to defy Aes Sedai, and we will take Althor again. She would not let him get away, not if she had to personally lead the entire White Tower to take him. The foretelling had been certain. She would triumph. Casting an uneasy glance at Alviarin, Kovarla shifted her feet again. Mother, those men... I think... Do not think, Elida snapped. Her hands clasped the knitting needles convulsively, and she leaned forward so fiercely that Kovarla actually raised a hand, as though to fend off an attack. Alviarin's presence had slipped from Elida's mind. Well, the woman knew what she knew now. That could be dealt with later. You have maintained secrecy, Kovarla, aside from informing the keeper. Oh, yes, Mother, Kovarla said hastily. Her head bobbed with eagerness, glad that she had done something right. I entered the city alone and hid my face until I reached Alviarin. Gawain meant to accompany me, but the bridge guards refused to let any member of the younglings pass. Forget Gawain Trakand, Elida ordered. That young man remained alive to trouble her plans, it seemed. If she ever did turn out to be alive still, she would pay for failing in that, on top of letting Althor escape. You will leave the city as circumspectly as you entered, daughter, and keep yourself and the others well hidden in one of the villages beyond the bridge towns until I send for you. Dorlan will do nicely. They were in barns in that tiny hamlet which had no inn, the least their bungling deserved. Go, now, and pray that someone above you does arrive soon. The hall will demand amends for this unparalleled catastrophe, and at the moment it seems you stand highest among those at fault. Go. Kovarla's face went white. She tottered so, making her curtsy to leave. Elida thought she might fall. Bunglers! She was surrounded by fools, traitors, and bunglers. As soon as Elida heard the outer door close, she hurled down her knitting and sprang to her feet, bounding around the arm. Why have I not heard this before? If Althor escaped, what was it you said? 7 days ago? If he escaped 7 days ago, someone's eyes and ears must have seen him. Why was I not informed? I can only pass on to you what the Ajahs passed to me, Mother. Alviarin adjusted her stole calmly, not a whit ruffled. Do you really need to commit a third debacle by attempting to rescue the sisters? Elida dismissively. Do you really believe Wilders can stand before Aes Sedai? Galena let herself be surprised. She must have. She frowned. What do you mean, a third debacle? You didn't listen, Mother. Shockingly, Alviarin sat without being given permission, crossing her knees and serenely arranging her skirts. Kovarla thought they might have held out against the Wilders, though I believe she is nowhere near as certain as she tried to pretend. But the men were another matter. Several hundred of them in black coats, all channeling. She was very certain of that, and so were the others, apparently. Living weapons, she called them. I think she nearly soiled herself just remembering. Elida stood as if pole-axed. Several hundred? Impossible. There can't be more than... She walked to a table that seemed all ivory and gilt, and filled herself a goblet of wine punch. The lip of the crystal pitcher rattled against the crystal goblet, and almost as much punch went onto the golden tray. Since Althor can travel, Alviarin said suddenly, it seems logical, at least, that some of these men can too. Kovarle is quite sure that was how they arrived. I suppose he is rather upset at his treatment. Kovarla seemed somewhat uneasy about it. She implied that a number of the sisters were. He might feel he owes you something. It would not be pleasant to have those men suddenly stepping out of thin air right here in the tower, would it? Elida practically tossed the punch down her throat. Galena had been instructed to begin making Althor supple. If he came for revenge, if there really were hundreds of men who could channel, or even 100, she had to think. Of course, if they were coming, I believe they would have by now. They would not have wasted surprise. Perhaps even Althor doesn't wish to confront the full tower. I suppose they have all returned to Camelin, to their black tower, which means, I fear, that Tauvain has a most unpleasant shock awaiting her. And an order for her to return immediately, Elida said hoarsely. The punch did not seem to help. She turned and gave a start to find Alviarin right in front of her. Maybe there were not even 100. Not even 100? At sunset, 10 would have seemed madness, but she could not take the chance. Write it out yourself, Alviarin. Now, right now. And how is it to be gotten to her? Alviarin tilted her head, icily curious. For some reason, she wore a faint smile. None of us can travel. The ships will put Tauvain and her party ashore in Andor any day now, if they have not already. You told her to divide into small groups and avoid villages so as to give no warning. No, Elida. I'm afraid Tauvain will regather her forces near Camelin and attack the Black Tower without any word from us reaching her. Elida gasped. The woman had just called her by name, and before she could begin to splutter with outrage, worse came. I think you are in great trouble, Elida. Cold eyes stared into Elida's, and cold words slid smoothly from Alviarin's smiling lips. Sooner or later, the Hall will learn of the disaster with Althor. Galena might have satisfied the Hall, possibly, but I doubt Kovarla will. They will want someone higher to pay. And sooner or later, we will all learn Tauvain's fate. It will be difficult to keep this on your shoulders then. Casually, she adjusted the Amerlin's stole around Elida's neck. In fact, it will be impossible if they learn any time soon. You will be stilled, made an example, the way you wanted to make Swan Sanche. But there might be time to recover if you listen to your keeper. You must take good advice. Elida's tongue felt frozen. The threat could not have been clearer. What you have heard tonight is sealed to the flame, she said thickly, but she knew that the words were useless before they were out of her mouth. If you mean to reject my advice. Alviarin paused, then began to turn away. Wait! Elida pulled down the hand she had stretched out unaware. Stripped of the stole, stilled. Even after that, they would make her howl. What? She had to stop and swallow. What advice does my keeper offer? There had to be some way to stop this. Sighing, Alviarin came close again. Closer, in fact. Much too near for anyone to stand to the Amerlin, their skirts almost touching. First, I fear you must abandon Tovane to whatever comes, for the moment at least. And also Galena and whoever else was taken prisoner, whether by the Aiel or the Ashaman. Any attempted rescue now must mean discovery. Elida nodded slowly. Yes, I can see that. She could not take her horrified eyes away from the other woman's demanding gaze. There had to be a way. This could not be happening. And I think it is time to reconsider your decision about the tower guard. Don't you really think the guard should be increased after all? I can see my way clear to do that. Light. She had to think. So good, Alviarin murmured, and Elida flushed with helpless rage. Tomorrow you will personally search Josane's rooms and Adalorna's. Why under the light would I... The woman tugged her striped stole again, roughly this time, almost as if to yank it off or saw through her neck with it. It seems that Josane found an Angreal some years before and never turned it in. Adalorna did worse, I fear. She removed an Angreal from one of the storerooms without permission. When you have found them, you will announce their punishment immediately. Something quite stiff. And at the same time, you will hold up Dorés, Kiyoshi, and Ferellian as models of preserving the law. You will give each a present. A fine new horse will do. Elida wondered whether her eyes were going to pop right out of her face. Why? From time to time, a sister kept an Angreal to herself in defiance of the law, but the penance was seldom more than a stern slap on the knuckles. Every sister knew the temptation. And the rest? The effect was obvious. Everyone would believe Dorés and Kiyoshi and Ferellian had exposed the other two. Josane and Adalorna were green, the others brown, gray, and yellow, respectively. The green Aja would be furious. They might even try to get back at the others, which would incite those Ajas, and... Why do you want to do this, Alviarin? Elida, it should be enough for you that it is my advice. Mocking honeyed ice suddenly turned to cold iron. I want to hear you say that you will do as you are told. There's no point in me working to keep the stole on your neck otherwise. Say it. Elida tried to look away. Oh, Light, she had to think. Her belly was clenched in a knot. I will do as I am told. Alviarin smiled that chilly smile. You see, that did not hurt very much. Suddenly she stepped back, spreading her skirts in a moderate curtsy. With your permission, I will withdraw and let you find some sleep in what remains of the night. You have an early morning ahead, with orders to issue for High Captain Chubane and apartments to search. We have to decide when to let the tower know about the Ashaman, too. Her tone made it clear that she would decide. And perhaps we should begin planning our next move against Althor. It is about time the tower stood openly and called him to heel, don't you think? Think well. I give you good night, Elida. Dazed, wanting to sick up, Elida watched her go. Stand openly? That would invite attack by these... What did the woman call them? These Ashaman. This could not be happening to her. Not to her. Before she realized what she was doing, she hurled the goblet across the room to shatter against a tapestry of flowers. Seizing the pitcher with both hands, she raised it overhead with a shriek of fury and flung that, too, in a spray of punch. The foretelling had been so certain. She would... Abruptly she stopped, frowning at the tiny shards of crystals clinging to the tapestry, the larger pieces scattered across the floor. The foretelling. Surely that had spoken of her triumph? Her triumph! Alviarin might have her minor victory, but the future belonged to Elida, as long as Alviarin could be gotten rid of. But it had to be done quietly, in some way so that even the hall would want silence. A way that would not point to Elida until it was too late, should Alviarin's sails gain wind. And suddenly the why came to her. Alviarin would not believe if she was told. No one would. Could Alviarin have seen her smile then, the woman's knees would have turned to jelly. Before she was done, Alviarin would envy Galena, alive or dead. Pausing in the hallway outside Elida's apartments, Alviarin studied her hands by the light of the stand lamps. They did not shake, which surprised her. She had expected the woman to fight harder, to resist longer, but it was begun and she had nothing to fear. Unless Elida learned that no fewer than 5 Ajas had passed mention of Althor to her in the last few days. The deposing of Kola Vair had sent every Aja's agent in Kyrian flying for a pen. No, if Elida did learn, she was safe enough, with the hold she had on the woman now, and with Messana as patron. Elida, though, was finished, whether she realized or not. Even if the Ashaman failed to trumpet their crushing of Tovain's expedition, and she was sure they would crush it after what Messana had told her of events of Dumai's wells, all the eyes and ears in Camelin truly would gain wings once they learned. Lacking a miracle, such as the rebels appearing at the gates, Elida would suffer Swan Sanche's fate in a matter of weeks. In any case, it had begun, and if she wished she knew what it was, all she really had to do was obey, and watch, and learn. Perhaps she would wear the 7-striped stole herself when all was done. In the early morning sunlight streaming through her windows, Siain dipped the pen, but before she could write the next word, the door to the hall opened and the Amerlin swept in. Siain's thick black eyebrows rose. She would have expected anyone else at all before Elida, perhaps not excluding Randall Thor himself. Still, she set the pen down and rose smoothly, pulling down the silver-white sleeves she had pushed up to keep clear of the ink. She made the degree of curtsy proper to the Amerlin's seat from a sitter in her own apartments. "I do hope you haven't found any white sisters hiding away Angreal, Mother." She did hope it quite fervently. Elida's descent on the Greens a few hours ago, while most of them slept, was probably still producing wails and gnashing of teeth. In living memory, no one had been ordered birched for keeping back an Angreal, and now there were to be 2. The Amerlin must have been in one of her infamous cold furies. But if she had been then, no sign of it remained now. For a moment she regarded Siain silently, cool as a winter pond in her red-slashed silks, then glided to the carved sideboard, where painted ivory miniatures of Siain's family stood, all years dead, but she still loved every one. "You did not stand to raise me, Amerlin," Elida said, picking up the picture of Siain's father. She set it down hastily and took up her mother instead. Siain's eyebrows almost rose again, but she tried to make it a rule not to let herself be surprised more than once in a day. "I was not informed that the hall was sitting until afterward, Mother." After all these years, a touch of Lugard still clung to her voice. "Yes, yes." Abandoning the paintings, Elida glided to the fireplace. Siain had always had a fondness for cats, and carved wooden cats of every sort crowded the mantelpiece, some in amusing poses. The Amerlin frowned at the display, then squeezed her eyes shut and gave her head a tiny shake. "But you remained," she said, turning quickly. "Every sitter who was not informed fled the tower and joined the rebels. Except you. Why?" Siain spread her hands. "What else could I do but stay, Mother? The tower must be whole. Whoever the Amerlin," she added to herself. "And what's wrong with my cats, if I may ask?" Not that she ever would aloud, of course. Sarela Bagand had been a fierce mistress of novices before being raised Amerlin's seat, the very year she herself earned the shawl, and a fiercer Amerlin than Elida could be with a sore tooth. Siain had had the proprieties driven into her too hard and deep for mere years to shift, or any dislike for the woman who wore the stole. One did not have to like an Amerlin. "The tower must be whole," Elida agreed, rubbing her hands together. "It must be whole." Now, why was she nervous? She had 99 kinds of temper, all hard as a knife and twice as sharp, but nervous the woman was not. "What I say to you now is sealed to the flame, Siain." Her mouth twisted wryly and she shrugged, giving her stole an irritable twitch. "If I knew how to make the seal stronger, I would," she said, dry as yesterday's dust. "I will hold your words in my heart, Mother. I want you I command you to undertake an inquiry, and you must indeed hold it in your heart. The wrong ear hearing of it might mean death and disaster for the whole tower. Siane's eyebrows twitched. Death and disaster for the whole tower? In my heart, she said again. Will you sit yourself, mother? That was proper in her own apartments. May I pour you some mint tea or plum punch? Waving away the offer of refreshment, Elida took the most comfortable chair, carved by Siane's father as a gift when she received the shawl, though of course the cushions had been replaced many times since. The Amerlin made the country chair seem a throne, all stiff back and iron countenance. Most ungraciously, she did not give permission for Siane to sit too, so Siane folded her hands and remained standing. I have thought long and hard on treason, Siane, since my predecessor and her keeper were allowed to escape. Helped to escape. Treason must have been at the core of that, and I fear only a sister or sisters could have effected it. That would certainly be a possibility, Mother. Elida frowned at the interruption. We can never be sure who has the shadow of treason in her heart, Siane. Why, I suspect that someone arranged for an order of mine to be countermanded. And I have reason to believe that someone has communicated privately with Randall Thor. To what end I cannot say, but that surely is treason against me and against the tower. Siane waited for more, but the Amerlin only looked back at her, slowly smoothing her red-slashed skirts. Exactly what inquiry do you wish me to make, Mother? She asked cautiously. Elida bounded to her feet. I charge you to follow the stench of treason, no matter where it leads or how high, even to the keeper herself. Yes, even to her. What you find, whoever it leads to, you will bring before the Amerlin seat alone, Siane. No one else must know. Do you understand me? I understand your commands, Mother. Which, she thought, once Elida had departed even more swiftly than she had come, was about all she did understand. In order to think, she took the chair the Amerlin had vacated, fists pressed beneath her chin in just the way her father had always sat thinking. Everything fell to logic, eventually. She would not have stood against Swan Sanche had she proposed the girl as Amerlin in the first place. But once it was done and all...
All right, everyone. I'm going to call into this stream for tonight. Excuse me. I want to thank everyone for stopping by and everyone who continues to stop by. I definitely appreciate all y'all's support. Until next time, everyone, y'all stay safe.